On the occasion of the 16th anniversary of the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, joining us in this new studio now is Her Excellency Ambassador of Canada to the State of Kuwait, Aliya Mawani, to talk to us more about her country's initiative to prevent and end violence against women and girls. Your Excellency, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What is the significance of the 16-day of activism campaign for Canada, and how does the Canadian Embassy leverage it to combat gender-biased violence?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me on this first day of the campaign. As was mentioned in the introduction, today is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And it also marks the start of the 16 Days of Activism campaign. And we have it, because unfortunately today in the world, violence against women and girls is still the most prevalent form of violence and persecution in the world today. It's over 25 years actually since the International Day was instituted, and it remains, a huge problem. And, I think for Canada and for Kuwait too, there's a lot of efforts here in Kuwait to raise awareness. It's important because when women and girls feel unsafe, when there's gender-based violence, when people are being violated on the basis of who they are, right? It means that they're not safe, right? And it means that, as long as women and girls are not safe, they don't feel safe, they can't contribute fully to society. They can't contribute their ideas, their skills, their talents, because they're worried about their own safety and protection. And then when we have 50% of the population that cannot participate fully, then it actually affects our whole society, right? It's bad for society. And if we look at the world today, there's over 700 million women and girls who have suffered some form of violence in the world. There's over 1 in 5 at the moment right now there's actually 5 girls every year, every minute, every year, who are being killed by even a member of their family. To do with their gender. So I think that tells you, right, just how serious this is. It needs to stop, and that's why we have this campaign. It's important to Canada because we, as Canadians, we think it's important for every member of society to be able to participate equally and fully. And that's important here in Kuwait. We've seen a lot of local efforts also to draw attention to the 16 days and to this issue. As the Canadian Embassy, we leverage this period of the campaign to really highlight the issue of violence against women and girls, and to spotlight the efforts of partner organizations here in Kuwait, organizations like the Orange Campaign, Seroptimist, Abolish 153, and others that are doing really important work, and also to have our own initiatives with partners. For example, this year we're doing partnerships with Girl Up Kuwait, with Young Ambassadors, with UNHCR.
Absolutely, I would like to actually ask you more about this. This year, the Canadian Embassy in Kuwait is partnering, like you said, with the Higher Commission for Refugees, especially during the campaign, to raise awareness about the gender violence. But what do you, as the embassy, to promote human rights? How does this issue to relate to refugees, as you mentioned, when you partner up with the UN entity, for example? So
that's a really good question. So refugees are particularly vulnerable to violence when they are fleeing different kinds of persecution, and especially women and girls. So what we find is that when they are fleeing, whether they're being displaced or whether they're fleeing to another country, unfortunately, it's very easy for people to take advantage of them because they're desperate, right? They've left home, they're looking for safety, they're looking for a new place. So what we see, unfortunately, is like I said, people taking advantage. Maybe they will, they will exact violence on them in response, in return for example, getting a ride somewhere, transportation, maybe they might be violated in exchange for getting food, for example. So unfortunately, we do see that practice. Even at times, for example, when refugees might be in a camp situation where they might be a bit safer, we do see this. I used to actually, before becoming a diplomat, I worked with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So I have a lot of respect for what they do. And in one of the camps that I was working in, what we would see, for example, is that culturally, right, it was the role of women and girls to go and collect firewood. Now, as the wood got cut down, they had to go further and further from the camp to be able to get the wood. And what would happen is the bandits would come and attack them. and while they were collecting firewood. So what we had to do is we had to work with the community to say, we understand that for you, you see this as a woman's job. However, is it possible to do this differently? Maybe for them to be accompanied by a man, or maybe for the men to help, so that they're not being put at risk. The other thing is planning. You know, often women and girls are not involved in planning for camp setups or places. So what happened was, for example, is that the toilets were put very far away from where the women and girls would sleep. So in the middle of the night, they would go to use the facilities and they would be attacked. So it's also about inclusion.
So Your Excellency, you're saying to get them involved and actually have a voice for them when they ever have issues.
Exactly.
Your Excellency, how does your commitment to empowering communities align with the embassy's efforts, especially in the state of Kuwait during the activism campaign? And before we let you go, we also want to see your key message to our viewers as well.
Absolutely. So this is something that the Canadian government takes very, very seriously. So all of our embassies all over the world, we are involved in the 16 Days campaign. We promote efforts to combat violence against women, gender-based violence. I personally am very, very committed to this issue, and it's because I've seen firsthand the damage that this kind of violence can do. I've seen it in my work as a diplomat. I've seen it in my work with the UN and with NGOs. And you can really see the difference. When people are not afraid, right? When they're not scared for their safety, the way that they can show up, the way that they can participate is so different, and it's beneficial for all of us. And I've unfortunately also been on the receiving end of this. I've experienced it in the context of my work. And I think sometimes that, in a context where I should have been able to feel safe, right? I think sometimes there's a stereotype that we have in our minds of who these kinds of things happen to. Yes. And so one of my messages is that actually it can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter how educated you are, how well-traveled you are, how wealthy you are. This unfortunately can happen to anyone. So when one encounters somebody to whom this has happened, it's really important to listen, to let them know that you believed them, and to find ways to support. But I think my overall message is that it's up to all of us. And the Canadian theme for the 16 Days of Activism this year is Come Together, Act Now. And I think that really sums it up. That it's not just a women's problem. It's a problem for all of us to tackle, because as long as some people in our society are not safe, or globally are not safe, then our society isn't safe. And so we need to do this together. It's up to all of us to work together to change the attitudes that perpetuate, violence against women and girls. And so I would urge everyone to do what they can. I think everyone has a role to play, from young people to older people. It can be through learning more. It can be through raising awareness. It can be through supporting people. It can be developing actually concrete skills that you can use to support by working on laws and legislation, to make sure that these issues get taken seriously. So that's my message. Come together, act now.
Absolutely. Your Excellency, of course, we would rather have more in-depth discussion about it, but we appreciate your time joining us. Thank you very much
for having me.